In July 2022, Hypixel added what would become the most overpowered enchant in the entire game. It all started with a simple description: deal bonus damage based on your last critical hit. A normal enchant, nothing that should have broken anything. 6 years later, it lets solo players one-shot a boss that was designed for a 4-person team, while also printing 200 million coins per hour, roughly $50 every single hour. Hypixel has patched it over 6 times, and it is still completely broken. By the time the community was done with it, Rend had produced world records and survived every single attempt Hypixel had made to shut it down. Methods were discovered, patched, and replaced within days. The people behind them were always one step ahead. This is the full history of Rend, every era, every patch, every workaround. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a community outsmarted a development team for 6 years straight. Before Kudra existed, and before any of what you're about to see in this video, Rend already has been broken once. On June 15, 2021, players discovered that Rend could be weaponized in dungeons in a way Hypixel has never intended. The method was simple: get a high critical hit with any weapon, swap to Rend bow, and shoot a single arrow, then activate your ability. At the time, Rend pulled infinite arrows, not 5, infinite. Every arrow actually dealt damage based on the single inflated critical hit. Against the Master Mode 5 boss, players were able to hit upwards of 600 million damage per hit, and against normal dungeon mobs, the numbers reached the billions. The exploit spread through the dungeon community quickly, and players used it constantly, placing first in run, which drove up the price of Rend bows almost overnight. However, on August 13, 2021, Rend was nerfed to pull in a maximum of 5 arrows instead of infinite. Sword swapping, the mechanic that made the critical hit possible, was also patched at the same time, making the method far harder to execute constantly. Therefore, Dungeon Rend was effective finish. For about a year, Rend went quiet, and then Kudra was added to the game. Kudra was added and revamped through late 2021, and by December 8 of that year, players had already started finding ways to apply Rend to it. The early methods were quiet. A small group of players figured out the mechanic and kept it private. Most of the player base had no idea it was happening. Before the next strategy, there was another method that most players never knew existed. It's called Infinirend, or Infinirend for short. It was discovered by a player called Banana the Bot. The mechanic relied on entities, specifically orbs and tentacles already present in the Kudra fight. The ability would reactivate infinitely based off the entities on the boss fight, chaining damage far beyond a single activation. It was eventually replaced by the edible Mace Era, but Infinirend was the bridge between Dungeon Rend and the Kudra meta that followed. But then, in June 2021, a forum post had appeared. A player who noticed Rend damage dealing a lot than it should. Most people ignored it at the time, and that forum post would eventually point the way towards what came next. Rend officially went public on September 14, 2023. A video was uploaded showing a Kudra kill with a completion time of 1 minute and 15 seconds. The community identified the method within days. What had been kept private for years became public knowledge overnight. The item at the center of it was the edible mace. You see, the edible mace had an ability that applied to every hit you dealt, and the additive damage boost applied to the moment the boomerang left your hand. Players activated the mace before throwing the bone, loading the boomerang with the full multiplier from the lunge, and then Rend was fired on impact. In simple terms, they found a way to make Rend read a damage number it was never supposed to see. Hypixel patched the edible mace ability so it no longer applied to both. What happened next is what separated Rend's story from a normal exploit. Within days, players had found a replacement. The new method centered around Doggy Armor, which is massive armor if you didn't know, a set that amplified damage in a specific way, combining a different pet to push numbers high enough for Rend to one-shot Kudra. They started with the Blaze Pet, and then moved on to the Ender Dragon, which hit even harder, and finally the Golem Pet, which hit harder still. Each one produced more damage than the last, and each one was patched. The reason every Doggy method worked the same was the Push Sword, which had an ability that applied to bow damage, so when Hypixel finally patched that interaction directly, every Doggy method died at once. But before that patch landed, there was also a Soul's Rebound method discovered between Infinirend and the edible Mace Era. It deserves a mention even if there's barely any footage. Soul's Rebound was probably the second most overpowered version of Rend that has ever existed. Players at the time had terrible gear by today's standards and were still one peak in Kudra with it. If the meta meta existed today with current gear, players would be dealing hundreds of millions of damage per shot. The only method that edges it today is the Doggy Megalodon. The Doggy Megalodon Era combination was the most extreme version of Rend anyone had documented. For the first time, a single player could kill Kudra alone, in one hit, a boss specifically designed to require 4 players. This lasted only a few days, and with the Doggy method gone, players moved to the Blade of Volcano, carrying a separate bug that doubled damage on specific attack angle. Kudra has 4 attack positions, the bug only activated on 2 of them, and the players used those 2. Hypixel patched the double damage bug and the Blade era ended. Rend then faced a challenge from within the player base rather than from the admin. The Mosquito Bow had emerged as a dominant Kudra weapon, and for roughly 2 or 4 weeks, it simply outperformed Rend. The community moved on. Rend was not patched during this period, it was just outclassed, until the admins decided to fix it and nerfing it. The Mosquito Bow era ended and Rend came back. While Kudra Rend was cycling through all these iterations, a completely different method has been developing in parallel, on a different boss completely. Blaze cannot be hit by bows directly, and players found a workaround using the Snowman Pet, a companion that fires snowballs, dealing a percentage of your last melee damage. The exploit actually required to trigger Rend to generate a massive enormous number and let the snowman repeat it on the Blaze passively. Set it up once and walk away, and by early 2024, access to this method was so valuable since it was private, and it started being sold and bought within the community. I personally paid 200 million coins to learn it, around $50 real life money, and the next morning, Snowman Pet prices across the auction house had doubled. Someone let the method out. During this area, players were starting to get banned. The community concluded that Hypixel had built a detection for Rend and was acting on it, since it was actually bug abusing. However, the bans were actually for macros. Players had been using scripts to swap items faster than any human could manage. Hypixel detected swap speeds, nothing to do with Rend. In the same patches, the Snowman Pet actually was modified and nerfed to only dealing 500k max damage, not because anyone had connected it to Rend, as the pet was flagged for being too overpowered. Hypixel had accidentally ended the Blaze method without understanding why they had done it. The Kudra method wasn't mentioned anywhere in the node. Snowman Pet had risen in value specifically because of Blaze Rend. When the method died, the value collapsed. This pattern repeated through Rend's entire history. Whenever an item sat at the center of the current method, it became more expensive and then crashed when Hypixel patched it. If you track the Rend meta closely enough, the auction house movement were predictable every time. The Kudra Rend method that exists today is built around the Boomerang, a weapon that doubles the damage on return throw. The sequence is precise: throw the bone while the highest possible stats are active, then swap gear while it's still in the air. Here's why that works. The Boomerang locks in whatever stats you had at the exact moment of throw. Those stats travel with the projectile and cannot be changed mid-flight, but the damage multiplier that apply to the hit are determined by what you're wearing when it connects. So the goal is maximum stats at throw, then swap to the gear that maximize your multipliers on return. Think of it as loading with one setup and shooting with another. What makes the current era remarkable is that the core mechanic has never been touched, only the specific items layered around it. The Blade of the Volcano returned in this era, and its double damage was when the Blade of the Volcano was patched, players moved on to Tuxedo armor with habanero tactics for a different multiplier. Reaper armor then entered the meta, carrying flat bonus damage that becomes substantial after all other multipliers are applied. Hypixel patched Reaper armor to stop functioning if you're swapped off it, but players never stopped swapping off it. By this point, the method required coordinating 3 separate armor sets in a single run, swapping from Terror to Reaper armor and then Tuxedo. The most recent development is the Ice Spray wand Rend, held by the fastest Rend player in the group, who applies a party-wide damage buff before the Boomerang connect. One player, one spray, and every player's Rend is amplified at the same time. It only works on the throw, not the pull. Timing window is tight enough that only the fastest players in the run can execute it reliably. At Kudra's peak, players using Rend on Kudra were generating 20 times the coins of a normal player. The gap was large enough that a secondary economy formed around it. Fresh accounts leveled up specifically to grind Kudra with Rend and then sold through an official channel. On the competitive side, the legitimate world record holder belongs to Future77, the top Kudra player in the game by both total runs completed and the fastest legitimate time. His record stands at 52 seconds. If you want to see what peak Rend play actually looks like, he actually made a guide about it. 52 seconds, no cheats, a boss designed for a full coordinated team, and an enchant that Hypixel has been patching since 2021. Dungeon Rend is gone, Blaze Rend is gone, the Snowman Pit is fixed without Hypixel understanding what it actually fixed. However, Kuder Rend is fully working as of 2026. Same enchant, same principle, years of patches. I reached out to a few players who have been using Rend since the early days, and this is what they had to say. The history of Rend is the history of a community that understands the game better than the people who built it. It broke dungeons, it broke Kudra. Every time Hypixel closed one door, players opened another. That pattern will never stop. Drop a comment. Which era do you think was the most broken? I read all. Subscribe if you're new. See you in the next one.